We are so happy to welcome Anthony Petrielli to the show to help us preview the Leafs' first-round matchup against the back-to-back Stanley Cup champs, the Tampa Bay Lightning. And for those few of our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with Anthony, he is a contributor at the Maple Leafs Hot Stove, where he writes the Leafs Notebook each week, and at Yahoo Sports Canada with his weekly column called 10 Insights and Observations. So it's safe to say that we're in good hands with this preview. And Anthony, we're so excited to have you on today. Thanks so much again for taking the time to join us as we head into the playoffs.
Thanks for having me, guys. Looking forward to this.
Okay, so let's just start with kind of how you're feeling initially. So when I say Leafs versus Tampa, what are your initial feelings? Like, what's your gut feeling about that?
Yeah, I've been starting to compile, all the info and look at all the different angles of how the series could go, how it could play out, how home ice might factor into it, if at all. There was a part of me today that was kind of talking myself into whoever gets to 3 wins first is going to end up winning the series, because I can't, like, if the Leafs go into Tampa in game 6 and they're down 3-2, I think Tampa closes it at home. But if the Leafs go up 3-2 and after game 5 in Toronto, and then probably lose to Tampa in Tampa and then come back to Toronto, I would favor the Leafs. So in many of these series, the Leafs haven't really had home ice, right? Like when they've played, right. And I know that they lost against Washington in Toronto in game 6, but that was the Leafs' first year in the playoffs. And as much as I liked Freddie, he was legitimately bad in that series. And then, against Columbus, there was no home ice. Against Montreal, there was no, like, these weren't real home ice advantages. I think it's going to be a factor. I think there's obviously a lot of pressure on them, but they're almost, I'm curious if they're going to be considered the underdog in this series, because I think that actually benefits them if they are.
Yeah, I kind of think they have to be, even though they're seated higher. It's Tampa. I don't know how they go into any series and they're not the favorites, especially against a Toronto team where, let's face it, they've been a little bit underwhelming in the playoffs, unfortunately. So I do think you're right, though. I think it kind of plays into their hands. If they're not favored, maybe it takes some of that pressure off.
Yeah, and there's pressure on them no matter what, right? The fans here don't care either way, but maybe there's a little bit that they can kind of drum up amongst themselves to say, people like genuinely don't believe in us, and kind of have that mentality. Whereas when they played the Habs and the Blue Jackets, it was like, all right, they should beat these guys. And people are already thinking about the second round half the way.
Exactly. And any little chip on their shoulder will go such a long way. But since we're talking about initial feelings, if you're comfortable, do you mind giving us, I know you said first to 3 wins, but right now, do you have a prediction in mind about where we stand?
I've gone back and forth on this, so I definitely reserve the right to change my mind up until Monday, like 7 o'clock, whenever they play them. But so far, so basically my thought process is, a lot of people, even just conversations I'll have around hockey arenas with friends, whatever the case is. I mean, people are down on the Leafs, in terms of like being able to pull through and win a series. And the thing I've always come back to is you can't convince me that Matthews and Marner don't go nuts at one point. Like, they don't just have a playoff run where they both go like nuclear, basically the way they have all season. Like, you can't tell me that they're just going to lose in the first round for like the rest of time. Like, at some point they're going to go crazy, right? Like they're going to go nuts, and they're going to have like a 10 or 12 point series, and they're going to push through. On the other hand, Andre Vasilevskiy is terrifying if you're the Leafs. Like, the gap between him and Campbell is potentially massive. So as much as I love Matthews and Marner, I'm sitting there going, this goaltender is legitimately terrifying and could be just the equalizer among all. And it's not like Tampa's short on talent. It's not like you're sitting there saying you just got to beat Vasilevskiy. It's like you have to get through all these really good players first, maybe the best defenseman in the league, some of the best playoff players, the forwards in the league.
Yeah.
And then you have to beat Vasilevskiy. Like, it's a tall task. So on that side, I want to say Tampa. But then, like I said at the beginning, part of me is sitting there going, the Leafs got to break through eventually. So at this point, I'm kind of leaning Toronto just for a few reasons. I think Matthews and Marner in particular have to break out at some point. I like the Leafs defense depth. I'm a little weary of maybe the top quality of their defensemen. Like Morgan Riley's good, but he's not, obviously he's in the second tier of defensemen. I would say there's like a top tier, and there's nothing wrong with it, but like being that second tier, I mean, the guys in the top are like Cale Makar, Victor Hedman, like Roman Yossi's going insane this year, and then he's probably in the next tier, but that's still a gap. And then he's paired with like Ilya Lyubushkin, who, you know, I like him, but he can't really control the puck or anything. But I like their depth of 7-8 options on defense. I think they have just enough depth scoring. I would love if Andre Kasha could come back and play. I think he would be a difference maker. So long-winded way of saying I'm leaning Leafs so far. I reserve the right to change it, but it's really, really tight.
Yeah. Well, that's the answer that we really wanted to hear as Leafs fans. We're happy to hear that you're hopping on the Leafs bandwagon. One thing that really caught my mind that you said I agree with as well is that really big gap potentially in goaltending between the Leafs and the Lightning. But a little bit of a positive note, in the month of April with a minimum of 5 stars, Jack Campbell has a top 10 save percentage in the league, which is very promising considering the downfall that he had at the beginning of the year. We know that Andrei Vasilevskiy is battle tested with like a 930 save percentage in his career in the playoffs. So for me, the biggest key to the Leafs' success, what has to go right, is their goaltending. I'm kind of interested to hear what you have to say about this. If you had one key to the Leafs' success, something that needs to go right for them to win the series, what is that in your mind?
Yeah, so goaltending aside, and so I'll like preface it with that, because I mean, goaltending, it always comes back to goaltending at the end of the day. We've seen it just way too many times in the playoffs. But for the Leafs, I'm gonna say, I mean, I think this might be a cop-out answer, and I can give a different one if you'd like, but it's health. Like, I don't know what's going on with Matthews. Obviously, he came back and put the 2 in, and he looked pretty dangerous, but he's got to stay healthy. Ideally, Bunting is able to return. Ideally, Muzzin can actually play a full playoff series for once, because he's been really good in the playoffs pretty much his entire career. And he's missed critical game after critical game for the Leafs in the playoffs. I mentioned Kasha before, like, God forbid he could ever actually just like come back in the lineup and play. But, you know, that's the risk when you sign a guy like that. That's, you know, he's a really good player. I don't think anyone in the league thought that he was bad, but he can't stay healthy. That's why the Leafs got him at the price that they did, not because the league was asleep on the player. So I think if the Leafs stay healthy, they have a really good chance. I think if they're, you know, obviously John Tavares got hurt last year in the playoffs too. I think the domino effect of them getting injured is far greater than Tampa's. Just sadly, like, you know, you look at, if one of the top 2 centers goes down for the Leafs, it's like Alex Kerfoot is your second line center. If, you know, Braden Point goes down for Tampa, it's Anthony Cirelli. Like that is a massive gap. You know, Tampa has, obviously they have Victor Hedman, but then they also have Ryan McDonough, who I think is still criminally underrated. They have Mikhail Sergachev, who is really good. You know, we already saw, like, with Muzzin, like the domino effect, and they kind of mitigated that by acquiring Giordano. But I think Tampa has a little bit more versatility and depth in if someone were to go down department. So the Leafs need to stay healthy, which is a bit of a luck thing, but it is what it is.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be a huge factor, especially like you talked about in Muzzin, even Tavares last year. Those are both devastating injuries in back-to-back series. So let's just hope that they can stay healthy. But you talked about Tampa's depth. So beyond their back-to-back champion status, which is scary in and of itself. Is it their depth, or is there another thing about Tampa that's really scares you as a Leafs fan going into this series that you think, oh boy, like that could really hurt us?
The thing that's scary for me about Tampa, and I think it's the thing that the Leafs they've fallen short on being able to prove so far in the playoffs, and will eventually need to if they want to get to where they want to go, is I look at Tampa and they could beat you any number of ways. That's the terrifying thing. Like when you play Florida is foot to the floor offense. Like that's it. Like that's their game. Like Bobrovsky is not scary to me. Their defense is, I think it's fine, but like it's nothing crazy. They're scoring. They're like first to 6 or whatever wins, and they can do it. But you watch Tampa, it's like they can run and gun you. They are physical and dirty when they need to be, right? Like we don't talk about, like fans don't generally talk about how, and I say this as a compliment, like it's not a knock on the guy. Like Nikita Kucherov is dirty. Like he has done a number of things throughout his career to solidify that status. And I mean that complimentary. Like he has no problem like doing that kind of stuff. The Leafs have a lot of guys who do have a problem like really mixing it. And I'm not saying they need to be dirty to like get where they need to go, but that being like that physicality and being able to adjust to those type of games, the Leafs have kind of shrunk at some of those moments, whereas Tampa kind of elevates their game. So they can do that. They can play defense, right? Like they beat the Islanders 1-0 to go to the Cup final, I believe, right? In Game 7, they obviously have a stud goalie. Like they can win literally anyway. And I'm not sure we can say that about the Leafs. And they're going to have to get there, right? Like I think that's part of what people have talked about over the years. It's like, well, like, are they physical enough? Are they good enough defensively? And like, no one's questioning their skill level. It's like, can you win these other ways? Like, you can't go through 4 playoff rounds winning one way.
Yeah, that's very true. We definitely expect, and we know that the big boys in this series are going to come to play: the Kucherovs and Matthews, the Marners, those guys that we know are cemented as top 15 players in the league. But here's a question that I'm really interested in hearing your answer to. Aside from the big boys, you know, like those Kucherovs and Stamkoses from either side, is there a depth player that you can name on either side that you think will have the biggest impact on this series?
Yeah, so for the Leafs, I would split it between, I don't know if I'm allowed to do that, but I would split it between Mikheyev and Engvall, because I mean, Mikheyev has 0 points in 12 playoff games, and Keefe was healthy scratching. He's healthy scratched Engvall in the playoffs both years, right? Like they both had great seasons this year. Like they've been critical to the Leafs' success. They're not like bus riders on this thing. Like they're not just there for the joyride. They're players. Like they matter to the Leafs, and like they need to bring it in the playoffs. And I understand that Mikheyev had the wrist injury and then came back, and I understand why he maybe has not produced so far in the playoffs, but he still needs to prove that he can produce in the playoffs, regardless of the circumstance of the past. He still is an unknown for this one. Engvall, largely the same way. Like they're both of them, just their speed and their size and their skating ability is such a difference maker, but they're both of them are not the most poised guys with the puck. And I do think you need a level of poise in the playoffs to really be a player. So on that end of thing, for the Leafs, to me, it's, you can't just look at Matthews and Marner and say do everything, right? Like and that's probably been my biggest concern with the way that they've been run over the past few years in the playoffs. It's like you look and like both those guys are playing 24, 25 minutes a night. It's way too much. They have no gas left in the tank towards the end of games or in overtime or at the end of series as they grind along. Like it's not a winning recipe over 4 rounds in the playoffs. So the Leafs need some depth. And to me, like those depth guys are primarily Mikheyev and Engvall. Like I don't think Camp can score much, if at all. I like him a lot, but he's not a scorer. It's just, that's the reality. Kyle Clifford, I'm not going to ask to score. Colin Blackwell, anything he does is gravy. I like Spezza. He's been good in the playoffs, but like Mikheyev and Engvall, Mikheyev in particular is probably going to play 15, 16 a night, and Sveta's going to be lucky to hit 10. So those guys are the most important on that side of things for me. And on Tampa, the guy that I would really hone in on is, and they have a number of guys at forward, but the guy who's been really sticking out to me as I've been looking into it is Eric Cernak. So he's a big right-handed D-man. They trust him in tough defensive matchups. He was the guy that Matthews like toe dragged and sniped so hard on Vasilevskiy about a month ago. I don't know if you remember that goal.
It was
happened.
beautiful.
Yeah, I was like, oh my God, what just happened? So that's Cernak, but he's a really good player, and he just got by a superstar in a random moment of time. But they're gonna trust him with a lot. We talked about Hedman, like their three lefties are all awesome, but the right side obviously matters as well. He is a difficult player to play against. I really like his game. I think he's been understated in Tampa's cup runs. I was looking at it today. I think he averaged like just under 20 minutes last year in the playoffs, like 1945 or something like that. And the year before he was like 20, like almost 20 and a half minutes. So he's like a 20-minute like eater for them that just plays defense and is tough to go against. And the other guy I would just throw out there, because I think he's generally been good against the Leafs. So I know I'm going over your one person limit, but is Alex Kalorne. I just think he's a good player. Like he's always been a problem for the Leafs. He's physical. Like he's the kind of guy that you've looked at for years and said, like, I wish the Leafs had this kind of guy to be like a secondary scorer. And like Mikheyev is kind of reaching that this year. So ironically, it's kind of why I picked him for the Leaf side. I look at Tampa and say, like, it's not enough to just shut down the top guys. Like you can't, like Kalorne's the kind of guy that could rip off like a 6-goal series. And that's a problem if he does.
Yeah, those are all definitely really good picks. Something in particular that sparked my mind, what you said, is Engvall. It was really cool to see Engvall have a resurgence this year. He went from that player who we thought was on a really good signing to being scratched, not being able to get into the lineup, and then now becoming somewhat of a mainstay on that third line, especially on that second line penalty kill, doing some really good offensive things on that penalty kill. But, we're going to end it off here with the question that I hate to ask, but, it's going to be asked. What happens here if, God forbid, the Leafs lose this series? Where does the franchise go from here? And the reason why I ask this is because on our podcast, we have a really cool segment where we have fans ask questions and we talk about them on the pod. And this one came up a lot. They said, if the Leafs lose this series, do we make a huge deal in the offseason? Do we clear the front office? And to be honest with you, I don't know the answer to this question. And I'd be really interested in hearing where you think we go from here.
Yeah, so it's interesting because if they do lose, I think people are going to call for the GM and the coach's head. I mean, I don't think that's just a fact. Like people are going to do it. People were doing it when they lost to the Habs. And I think we would just see like 6 years in a row. We get that Tampa was good, but you also lost to the Habs in Columbus and we just don't feel sorry for you. And it is what it is. I actually don't think that, and it's just my opinion. So I'm not saying this is what I would do, but I don't think that they would fire Dubas and Keefe. I think they would say that they had a franchise record in points and they showed progress in the regular season and blah, blah, blah. That's my guess. But I do think that there would be a major trade. I think there would be a shakeup. I think the question at hand would then be, and actually I should take this back a second. Unless Dubas was like 100% like, this is the group that I would walk back and this is my plan and you can't trade me, because we all know his we can and we will sign all these guys and keep them. So if he's gonna die on that hill, I think he would be gone. But I think if he would sit there and say, this is a really good regular season team, but maybe, and this is all premature, of course, because they could obviously just come back. They could just go far this year in the playoffs for once and make all of our lives a little bit easier and more enjoyable, because who wouldn't want that? But I think they could sit there and say, this is a really good regular season team, but it's maybe not deep enough across the board. I would personally sit there and say, like, you need to get a goalie. That would be my line of thinking. If they lose in the first round, I'm going to sit there and say, like, you need to actually pay a goalie. And I don't see how you can do it when you're allotting the money the way that you are. The dollars and cents don't make sense or add up. So that's why I just think it would be logical for them to move that around and say, like, we have to find a guy in net. Like, we have to find a stud. We have to find a guy that can steal us games. And maybe that's Campbell. I don't know. But, like, they've gotten lucky with him to this point, really. Like, I don't think when they traded for him that they thought this guy is going to be our starter. If anyone is lying if they say otherwise. I don't think that was, they needed a good backup at that point because of the whole waving McElhaney to keep Garrett Sparks, which was a disaster, right? So I think that's how I'd look at it. I don't even know if it would be a D-man because I like their defense. They've got some good young defenders that are coming up as well. Obviously, Morgan Riley's locked in. You know, I'm hopeful that Giordano will take a sweetheart deal to stay. I'm just going to look and say, like, they need a goalie. They need a guy who can steal them games.
And so to get really quickly before we fully wrap up, I'm really intrigued now.
What do you guys think would happen?
Well, what I think what will happen is something along the same lines, and I think that's the right call. Just because this team is, I don't know, in my opinion, they've been assembled really well. It's a really good team, and if they lose this series, it's not Montreal Part 2. It's Tampa Bay Lightning, the best team in the league for the past 2 years. So I'll be frustrated 100%. But then come 2-3 weeks down the road, I'll probably have be able to look back and be like, okay, maybe I was overreacting in the moment. I don't know. I think maybe they keep the group together for the most part, and maybe they do have to make a trade because I don't think you can come with the exact same group. But I do think that at least the guys at the top, I think they've done a good enough job to keep their jobs. Maybe my opinion will change if they lose in terrible fashion. But
I think they did as good of a job surrounding the core, given the available money, and without moving anyone that they possibly could have. So at some point, it's on the core. And I think they're also going to sit there and say, Nylander and Tavares have not been good together. And I know that they were both ultimately productive. I understand what their point totals were this year, but, like, they're not giving the Leafs a second line that their talent level suggests that they should. So now it's like, now we got to put one on the third line, and then we got to put one on the second line. And I think they would look at all that and say, like, is this the best use of our money?
That's true. Andrew, what do you think?
I think what they should do is what you said, but what I think will happen is if the Leafs get destroyed, I would say 5-1, 4-1. I have to think that the front office gets cleared. It's just been a long time coming, and sometimes, regardless of whether it's a good idea or not, sometimes you need a culture change. I don't think that that's the right idea, but I think that's what the market is going to ask for. And after having a bunch of disappointing years, it's tough to refute. When we lost to Boston and all those series, I would go, okay, Boston's Boston, but then came Columbus and then came Montreal, and now we're sitting here and we got to win. Something's going to happen. So I don't think that Dubas should go. I've talked about this a lot. I think Dubas is one of the best GMs in the league, but inevitably, if the Leafs get destroyed this series, I think it's time that they make a quick change up in that front office.
Yeah, if they get crushed, like, they'll be fired. Like, if they lose in like 5, like, they're gonna get fired. But if they lose in 7 and it's like a good series, and whatever happens, I think the only other thing that could potentially make them look bad is, like, if Minnesota goes on a huge run and Fleury's really good.
Yeah,
right.
Good point.
Because then it'll be like, well, why didn't you go get him? And I was in the camp of don't get Fleury.
Mm-hmm.
I love Giordano, so I'm extreme. I wanted him before the deadline, and then they got him, and I was like, awesome, and it didn't even cost him that much. And I think he's earned that. And if they could get him to sign for, like I said, some sort of sweetheart deal, I think that's going to go down as, like, one of his best trades.
Yeah.
So, but if Fleury goes on a heater and Minnesota goes on a run, which could both certainly happen, I think, and the Leafs lose in the first round, I think a lot of people are going to be upset.
Yeah, that Fleury angle is actually a really interesting point. I'd never actually thought of that. That'll make things even hotter in terms of temperature in this market if the Wild do something. We do want to be mindful of your time. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to come on and preview this series with us. This is like huge. We've been really excited over the past like week or so, kind of counting down the days. Before we fully wrap up, I do want to just give you a chance to let our listeners know where they can find your work on, or plug your work, plug your Twitter, your Instagram, where everyone can follow you.
Yeah, and quickly, I don't know if I cut you off before, Angelo. Did you have another question?
No, that's all that I wanted to hear.
Oh, okay. I wanted to make sure that I got everything. But yeah, Twitter, A Petrielli. I'll be covering the series pretty heavily at Maple Leaf Hot Stove. I'll be doing more league-wide playoff coverage at Yahoo. So I'm excited. I think it's going to be a good playoffs. I think the Leafs are going to make this crazy entertaining. The mountain to climb in front of them is daunting, but I always like to say, half jokingly but half truthfully, like without struggle, like triumph is meaningless. And I wouldn't want to see the Leafs coast into one. I want to see them like mow down all the top teams and do it the right way. So that it's there for the taking. They just got to do it now.
Yeah, I'm gonna say it. If the Leafs get past this series, I think they go all the way. It's just I think they need confidence that they can beat a big team when it matters the most. If they do it, I think there's a small chance that we see that cup brought back to Toronto this year, and that would be crazy.
I mean, the monkey off their back would be huge, right? Like win a series and then go play potentially Florida. Kind of, what we said. Like Florida is a lot more one-dimensional, unless Bobrovsky kind of also goes on a heater. I mean, goalies going on a heater is always the scary thing of any playoff. But beyond that, like I wouldn't be too worried about Florida and the Leafs' confidence and that going to their legs. And it would be wild if like Boston end around it as the wild card on the other side, and then they had to play Boston. That would be a hell of a path.
I would love that. I'd love to see them beat Tampa and then have to go up against the Bruins. That would be. I've been asking for that. Couple of times. So
I've been unsure if I wanted Boston the entire time. I've really shaded to Tampa, and then in the past like 2 weeks, I was like, oh no, they're gonna play Tampa.
Yeah.
So I shifted back on it. I don't know. Boston has their number, and there's something to be said for that. And I say this as a Leaf fan in the early 2000s that watched them just dummy the Sens year after year. They would lose in the regular season, and fans would go nuts, and I would just shrug my shoulders so hard, like, who cares? We know when playoff time comes. And every year it was the exact same thing. And Boston feels the same way about us. So
yeah, they do. That's for sure. That's for sure. I mean, maybe it's best that it doesn't happen because I don't think we can handle as a collective another Boston defeat. But I don't know, that dark part of me kind of wants them to do it. But with that being said, again, Anthony, thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to come speak with us. It's really a huge honor to have you on, and we look forward to keeping in touch in the future.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, guys. Really appreciate it.